Hello everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, a technical session called I Want My NPM. My name is Danielle Wombolt, and I'll be your moderator. I work here on the marketing team at NPM, and I'm excited to be hosting today's session. I'm pleased to introduce today's NPM speakers, Daniel Sauble, who is a product manager, and Orion Letizi, who is a product marketing manager. Before I hand it over to them, I have a few housekeeping items to cover about the presentation and the BrightTalk webinar platform. First, today's webinar will be available on demand after the live session and is accessible through the same link you're using now. We've also added some attachments which are available through the attachment tabs at the bottom of your screen. This is where you can find today's slides and other content, including NPM's blog and all of our webinars. Next, we'd love to hear from you during today's presentation. If you have a question for Daniel or Orion, please feel free to send it through the Ask a Question tab at the bottom of your player. We'll be answering questions at the end of this session, but please feel free to submit during any time. If we don't get to your question during today's webinar, we will be sure to follow up with you afterwards. Now over to Orion.
Thanks, Danielle. Hi, folks. Thanks for joining us. Today we'd like to share our thoughts on how to take full advantage of the tools and practices of open source JavaScript that we're all used to, but in an enterprise context. We'll start by going through JavaScript by the numbers, showing how the JavaScript ecosystem is huge and growth is accelerating, and that a large part of that story is a vibrant developer community paired with efficient and effective tools to facilitate code packaging and reuse. Unfortunately, friction between open source JavaScript and enterprise requirements can make it a challenge to take advantage of the full JavaScript ecosystem in an enterprise context. We'd like to close by presenting a formula for using the tools and best practices of open source JavaScript in the enterprise. With that, I'll hand it over to Daniel.
Great, thanks, Brian. Most popular programming language. And it's really interesting when you start to dig into some of the numbers around it. When you look at just the way people use NPM with JavaScript, you can see that there's 11 million developers. There's 42 billion downloads per month from the NPM Public Registry. And we just recently passed the 1 million package threshold for packages hosted on the Public Registry. And it turns out that, again, most people who use JavaScript use NPM as its package manager. And so it wasn't that long ago when the way you used JavaScript was to add a script tag to your HTML pointing to a JavaScript file hosted on some external server, but we've come a long way from there today. So today, 99.5% of JavaScript developers use NPM to manage their JavaScript. And of people who use JavaScript today, 94% anticipate they're going to use the same amount or more in the coming year. And so not only is JavaScript ubiquitous, but it's becoming even more ubiquitous. And these aren't just weekend projects. 80% of these people use JavaScript at work. And it's interesting also to see that the reason why people use JavaScript is because of this open source package ecosystem around the language. And 75% of people say that's why they use JavaScript. And so when we look at kind of a typical web app, you see that 97% of the code is downloaded from NPM. So it's really kind of amazing. These numbers are all really incredible. But just to kind of focus on that last one, 97% of that code comes from NPM. So in the same way that JavaScript is really the world's most dominant programming language, NPM by far is the most dominant way to manage JavaScript code. So I'm sure this comes to nobody's surprise, but there's definitely exponential growth in that ecosystem. And in the same way that you see this hockey stick with JavaScript, NPM has that same hockey stick. So I'm going to hand it over to Orion to talk a little bit about how this open source JavaScript ecosystem has an impact on your development workflows.
Cool. So as we all know, development with JavaScript is extremely modular. That's a significant part of why the library is so successful. The units of reuse are small enough that for any given need, you're likely to find that there's a package for that, and there also tends to be less overlap and redundancy. The extreme modularity does come at some degree of cost, however. In the old days, when there was just a few libraries to choose from, finding the right tool was more about reading the docs, but now it's more about finding the right package. And without a tool like NPM to provide package discovery and to manage the complex interdependencies between packages, the current shape of the library would be impossible to use. Another cost, of course, increased risk. The total vulnerability of your code, abilities in your code, and of each package in your dependency graph. And if by far the largest percentage of the code in your project comes from outside of your development group, you are not in control of the security risks that you're bringing into your team and into your production code. So with the explosive growth of the number of packages available, inevitably security and compliance risks creep in and become difficult to manage. So those risks in the enterprise are often poorly managed, especially where infrastructure and processes tend to lag behind the bleeding edge. The risk management tools that enterprises do have in place tend to be out of band of the standard developer workflow, and the friction of this tools mismatch causes a drag on productivity. It also provides a perverse incentive for developers to circumvent the institutional processes simply to get their jobs done. And this gap between the canonical JavaScript tools and processes and those often required in the enterprise make it difficult to discover vulnerabilities and assess impact enterprise-wide. With many customers who, despite having security tools in their CI/CD chain, have found vulnerable packages make it through to production anyway, and often to their surprise and chagrin, obviously. So using open source JavaScript does add risk to businesses, even though it provides a great deal of power. Often enterprises, because of this, are forced to sacrifice productivity and efficiency benefits of using the public registry in favor of mitigating risk. And especially since most large shops use many different programming languages, they tend to adopt some kind of private package repository solution that tries to manage the risks of using open source across all platforms. Unfortunately, polyglot artifact stores like that are built to serve a common denominator across all languages, which necessarily requires some compromise. For JavaScript developers, those compromises come in the form of limited collaboration across teams because search and discovery is limited or non-existent, and a non-standard, frustrating / inefficient JavaScript workflow that, in the worst case, can introduce more risk because of perverse incentive workarounds. The conflict between developer and enterprise needs leads to an impedance mismatch between what JavaScript developers are used to and want to do and what the enterprise allows. Enterprises need to ensure compliance, security, reliability, but they need tools to do that in a way that helps developers complete projects on time and under budget. And for my last slide, we have a solution for this impedance mismatch, a way for JavaScript developers to safely bring the best practices of open source JavaScript and the entire JavaScript ecosystem seamlessly into an enterprise context using the tools that they're familiar with and that they like to use. With that, I'll hand the mic over to Daniel to show how our flagship commercial product, NPM Enterprise, does just that.
So as Orion mentioned, there's this tension between what developers need from JavaScript and what enterprises need from JavaScript. So JavaScript is extremely popular, and so this is definitely a really important problem to solve. And unfortunately, NPM has a solution for this. So NPM Enterprise is a solution to this tension problem that checks a lot of boxes for both developers and enterprises. So it's kind of like a repository manager, but it's a repository manager that has a great developer experience with all those controls that enterprises need. So we'll kind of get into some of these areas in the following slides. So the first thing that NPM Enterprise gives you is really seamless integration with your existing developer workflows. It has full support for the NPM CLI, so all those NPM commands you use work just as well with NPM Enterprise as they do with the public registry. And the search experience is really great. Again, it works just as well as the public registry. So if you're searching your packages, you're not only searching the fields and metadata on those packages, but also the README. So you end up getting results that represent kind of what's in your private packages that are being hosted with NPM Enterprise, along with those public packages. And finally, the web interface for NPM Enterprise, again, is very, very similar to that public registry. And so the sum of all these things means that the learning curve for developers is very close to zero. Another thing that NPM Enterprise does, again, because it works a bit like a package manager, is that it not only provides transparent proxied access to the public registry, but it also provides a place where you can host your private JavaScript packages. And the reason why this is so great is that this allows you to take full advantage of those features we mentioned on the previous slide on the same convenient user interface. As a final point, NPM Enterprise gives you unlimited scopes for your packages, and so you don't really have to deal with the same sort of namespace contention that you would hosting packages on the public registry. A third thing that NPM Enterprise gets you is much better security. And so it has all the security features that you expect from the public registry. So things like those vulnerability reports when you run NPM audit or NPM install. It has two-factor authentication. It has information about security advisories. But it also adds a few features which provide additional security that really matters in an enterprise context. So things like role-based access control. Or that single sign-on, so you don't have to spend a lot of time provisioning or deprovisioning users. And then it's also a single tenant solution, so you don't have to share the same infrastructure with those thousands and thousands of other developers using the public registry. And kind of the last area of features that NPM Enterprise gets you is improved visibility and control into JavaScript. So, for example, we mentioned that there's an extreme level of modularity in JavaScript. And what NPM Enterprise is really good at is helping you tease out that web of transitive dependencies to better understand the true surface area of what your application is pulling in. It also helps you as a business understand the usage of JavaScript consumption in your organization. So these are things that are more difficult to get when you're just using the public repository. And then finally, NPM Enterprise provides controls around this so that it's easier to actually enforce organizational policies around how JavaScript is consumed. So this is a diagram which might help to better illustrate how NPM Enterprise could fit within your existing development workflow. So on the far left, you see the NPM Public Registry. So this is the thing that your teams and your tools talk to today. So you can see that NPM Enterprise kind of sits immediately to the right and serves as a drop-in replacement for that public registry. So as we mentioned, it's a single tenant instance with a bunch of security features that are useful in the enterprise. And because it sits in front of the public registry, it's in a really good place to provide enforcement, make sure that these security policies are actually applied in your organization. Another interesting point that you see here is that before, those teams talk directly to the public registry, but now they talk directly to NPM Enterprise. So when they're doing search and discovery, they're going through your NPM Enterprise instance. And this becomes really interesting for a number of reasons. One point of which is that it's a really great search experience. So rather than going through a third-party package manager that might not have a great search experience. And you can still talk to effectively what looks like the public registry and get all those same features that you know and love. But an even more interesting piece of this is that because NPM Enterprise lets you set policy around packages that are consumed in your organization, this helps you kind of shift left when it comes to picking packages that aren't going to break your builds. And so you can see up front if a package is going to break your build, and only choose packages that aren't going to. And so you end up with much fewer broken builds resulting from non-compliant package usage. And this can save a huge amount of time as well as frustration on the part of your developers. So as a last point, you can see also that NPM Enterprise fits really well with your existing tooling. In the same way that the people who talk to the public registry now just talk to NPM Enterprise, and instead of your package manager proxying the public registry, you just proxy NPM Enterprise, and it's basically just changing a URL. So it's really easy to add NPM Enterprise into your existing CI/CD pipeline. So I'll go ahead and let Orion kind of summarize what we talked about today.
Well, you know, obviously JavaScript is the dominant programming language, and and if you're using JavaScript, there's a toolkit that you know and love, and is sometimes hard to use in a large organization because they have restrictions on what tooling you're allowed to use. So we're offering a solution to that impedance mismatch in the form of NPM Enterprise. So you can have your NPM the way you like it, and the enterprise gets all of the security and compliance needs satisfied as well. Danielle, do you want to, should we take questions?
Definitely.
So I see one question here asking, how did you get those JavaScript usage stats? Is that info publicly available somewhere? So those stats come from, I believe it's called the 2018 is it like JavaScript ecosystem report, which I believe was generated through a survey. So that's where those numbers around JavaScript usage came from.
Yeah, and if you haven't, go ahead, Danielle.
I will add that in the attachment, so there'll be a link to the survey results.
It's really interesting. If you haven't looked at it yet, it's worth a look. Here's one. I'll take. I already have a package manager. How does NPM Enterprise work with other package managers? I mean, we sort of went over it, but the thing is that, like, yeah, the package manager, you're going to use the package manager you've got because that's what you have to use. But that part is really for the once you've thrown your code over the wall to into the build pipeline. What we're saying with NPM Enterprise is use this at the front of your development pipeline as a developer. You can use NPM Enterprise as essentially a drop-in replacement. You just log into it and you start using NPM Enterprise, and it looks and acts exactly the way the public registry works. And then when you want to use it in the downstream CI/CD pipeline, you can reconfigure which endpoint the package manager uses to look at the public registry, and it's as if nothing had changed. Cool.
And there's one other question here about asking whether NPM Enterprise works with other CLIs. So it definitely works with the Yarn, and in general, I would expect it to work the same as it against the public registry. So anything that works against the public registry would work against NPM Enterprise. And that was a deliberate design decision. So it looks like that's all the questions that we have from the audience.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Daniel and Orion. As mentioned earlier, today's webinar will be available on demand after the live session and is accessible through the same link you're using now. We've also added some related material which are available through the attachment tabs at the bottom of your screen. Finally, if you like what you heard today, please tweet out your thoughts on today's webinar using hashtag NPMFacts. Thank you for joining.